I never thought a stack of paperwork shoved under my windshield wiper on a freezing January morning would lead to the biggest legal fight of my life. But here we are. My name is Xavier Lockhart, and I have lived in the Pine Ridge Estates community in Eagle River, Alaska, for 6 years. When I bought my house back in 2019, the place seemed perfect. Decent neighbors, beautiful mountain views, and most importantly for me, direct access to some of the best snowmobiling trails in the state. I am an avid outdoorsman, and those trails were half the reason I chose this property. I own 3 snowmobiles, a couple of ATVs for summer use, and all the equipment that goes along with maintaining them. My detached garage is basically a workshop for my hobby. Everything was fine until about 2 years ago when the HOA board went through a complete turnover. The new president, a woman named Patricia Brennan, moved into the neighborhood with her husband in late 2022. Patricia is exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen. She is in her mid-50s, always has that speak to your manager haircut, and somehow finds a problem with everything everyone does. Within 3 months of moving in, she had gotten herself elected as HOA president, probably because nobody else wanted to deal with the headache. The paperwork under my wiper that January morning was a violation notice. I pulled it out and read it while standing in my driveway, my breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air. The notice claimed that my snowmobiles, which I kept parked on a concrete pad beside my garage, violated some obscure clause about recreational vehicles being visible from the street. I read it 3 times, confused because those machines had been sitting in that exact spot for 6 years without a single complaint. I decided to handle it the reasonable way first. That afternoon, I called the HOA office number listed on the notice. Patricia answered on the second ring. Pine Ridge Estates, HOA, this is Patricia speaking. Hi Patricia, this is Xavier Lockhart from 847 Timber Wolf Drive. I got a violation notice this morning about my snowmobiles, and I wanted to discuss it because I think there might be some confusion. There is no confusion, Mr. Lockhart. Your vehicles are in clear violation of our community standards, but they have been parked there for 6 years. I bought the house with that concrete pad already in place, and the previous owner used it for the same purpose. The rules are the rules, Mr. Lockhart. I do not make exceptions just because something has been overlooked in the past. You have 2 weeks to remove the vehicles from visibility or face a fine of $500 per day per vehicle. My jaw dropped. $500 per day for 3 snowmobiles. That is $4,500 a day. Then I suggest you move them promptly. Good day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there holding my phone, absolutely stunned. This woman had just threatened me with a fine that could bankrupt me in a month, over machines that had been legally parked for years. I spent the next few hours digging through every scrap of HOA documentation I had received when I bought the house. The original covenants, conditions, and restrictions document, known as the CC and Articus, had a section about vehicles. It stated that inoperable vehicles, commercial vehicles, and recreational vehicles stored on trailers could not be visible from the street. My snowmobiles were not on trailers. They sat directly on the concrete pad, and they were all in perfect working order. I used them at least twice a week during the winter season. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for the following week. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. When I arrived that Thursday evening, about 15 other homeowners were already there, most of them looking just as frustrated as I felt. Patricia sat at the front table with 4 other board members. She had a stack of papers in front of her and that pursed lip expression that screamed she was ready for battle. The meeting started with standard business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing landscaping contracts for the common areas. Then they got to new business, and Patricia looked directly at me. We have several ongoing violation issues to address. Mr. Lockhart, have you remedied your vehicle situation? I stood up. I would like to discuss that, actually. I have reviewed the CC and Articus thoroughly, and I do not believe my snowmobiles violate any written rule. They are not on trailers, they are operational, and they are parked on a designated concrete pad that was specifically built for that purpose. They are recreational vehicles, Mr. Lockhart. The rule is clear. The rule specifies recreational vehicles on trailers. Mine are not on trailers. Patricia shuffled through her papers with an annoyed expression. The spirit of the rule is to maintain aesthetic standards in our community. Your machines are an eyesore. That is your opinion, not a written rule. I bought my house specifically for the access to snowmobiling trails, and everyone knew these machines were here when you moved in. You cannot just retroactively enforce your personal preferences. Another board member, an older man named George, cleared his throat. Patricia, maybe we should table this and have our attorney review the specific language. We do not need to waste money on an attorney for something this obvious, Patricia snapped. The violation stands. Mr. Lockhart, you have 1 week remaining. After that, the fines begin. I sat down, furious but trying to keep my cool. After the meeting ended, 3 other homeowners came up to me. Apparently, Patricia had been on a violation spree, hitting people for everything from the wrong shade of mailbox paint to garden gnomes she deemed tacky. Nobody was happy, but everyone seemed afraid to fight back because of the potential fines. That week, I consulted with a real estate attorney in Anchorage named David Morrison. He reviewed my HOA documents and agreed that Patricia was overstepping. The language is pretty specific, David said during our phone consultation. Unless they can prove those snowmobiles are on trailers or are inoperable, they do not have a case. However, you need to be careful. HOA boards have a lot of latitude, and if they decide to dig in, this could get expensive and time-consuming. So what do you recommend? Send them a formal letter citing the specific CC and R language and requesting they rescind the violation. Keep everything documented. If they proceed with fines, we can fight it, but it might end up in court. I followed his advice. I sent a certified letter to the HOA board, carefully outlining my position and requesting a written response. The letter was delivered on a Monday. On Wednesday, I came home from work to find all 3 of my snowmobiles gone. I stood in my driveway, staring at the empty concrete pad where $30,000 worth of equipment had been sitting that morning. For a moment, I thought I had been robbed. Then I saw another notice stuck to my front door. This one informed me that the HOA had exercised its right to remove items in violation of community standards. My snowmobiles had been seized and were being held in a secure location. To retrieve them, I would need to pay all outstanding fines plus storage fees. I immediately called the police. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. I showed them the notice and explained the situation. So let me get this straight, the younger officer said, reading the notice. Your HOA took your property off your own land. That is exactly what happened. This morning they were here, I went to work, and now they are gone. That is theft. The officers exchanged glances. The older one, whose name tag Reed Martinez, scratched his head. This is tricky. Technically, if your HOA has the authority to enforce violations, they might have some legal standing. But taking the property without a court order seems extreme. Have you talked to a lawyer? I have one I have been consulting with. I am calling him as soon as you leave. Do that. In the meantime, I will file a report documenting the seizure. Keep copies of everything the HOA sends you. This might end up in civil court. After the officers left, I called David Morrison. He was shocked when I told him what had happened. They physically took your snowmobiles. Without a court order. According to this notice, they claim the CC and Articus give them the right to remove violations. Let me see if I can find that language. Can you email me a copy of the notice and your complete CC and Articus? I sent everything over immediately. David called me back 2 hours later, and he sounded angry. Xavier, they do not have that authority. There is a clause about the HOA's right to enter property to maintain common areas or address immediate safety hazards, but nothing that gives them the right to seize your personal property. This is illegal seizure, possibly theft. We need to act fast. What do I do? First thing tomorrow, I am filing for an emergency hearing. We will get an injunction requiring them to return your property immediately. This is going to cost some money up front, but based on what they have done, we will likely recover your legal fees and possibly additional damages. Do whatever you need to do. Those machines are my property and I want them back. The next morning, David filed the necessary paperwork with the Superior Court in Anchorage. Because Eagle River falls under the Anchorage jurisdiction, our case would be heard there. He requested an emergency hearing, arguing that the continued seizure of my property caused ongoing harm since I used the snowmobiles regularly for both recreation and accessing parts of my own property that were difficult to reach in winter. The court scheduled a hearing for the following Tuesday, 5 days away. In the meantime, I received another notice from the HOA. This one was even more audacious. It informed me that I now owed $6,000 in violation fines, plus $200 per day in storage fees for the snowmobiles. According to their math, I already owed over $7,000, and the amount was climbing. I forwarded the notice to David, who added it to our court filings. This actually helps our case, he told me. They are being so aggressive and unreasonable that it makes our argument stronger. Just do not pay anything and do not sign anything they send you. The days leading up to the hearing were incredibly stressful. I could not stop thinking about my snowmobiles sitting in some storage unit or worse, being damaged or sold off. I had one machine that was custom built, worth over $15,000 alone. These were not just vehicles to me. They represented years of investment and countless hours of enjoyment in the Alaskan wilderness. Tuesday finally arrived, and I met David at the courthouse. Patricia was there with the HOA's attorney, a stern-looking woman named Rebecca Walsh. We filed into the courtroom when called, and Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to my lawyer, took the bench. Judge Morrison was in her early 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that suggested she did not tolerate nonsense. She reviewed the filings for a few minutes before looking up at both sides. This appears to be a fairly straightforward matter, but I want to hear arguments. Miss Walsh, your client seized Mr. Lockhart's property from his own land. Please explain the legal basis for that action. Rebecca Walsh stood up, confident. Your Honor, the Pine Ridge Estates CC and Articus give the HOA board authority to enforce violations and take necessary actions to maintain community standards. Mr. Lockhart was given ample notice and opportunity to comply. His refusal left the board no choice but to remove the offending items. And which specific section of the CC and Articus grants the authority to seize personal property? Section 8.4, Your Honor, which allows the board to enter property and address violations. Judge Morrison flipped through the documents. Section 8.4 addresses entry for maintenance of common areas and emergency safety hazards. I see nothing about seizing personal property. Mr. Morrison, your response. David stood. Your Honor, the HOA has committed illegal seizure. The CC and Articus do not grant them the authority they claim. Moreover, the underlying violation itself is questionable. The restriction is on recreational vehicles stored on trailers. Mr. Lockhart's snowmobiles are not on trailers. They sit directly on a concrete pad that has been used for this purpose since before he owned the property. The HOA president has a personal vendetta and is abusing her position. That is a serious accusation, Counselor. I have evidence, Your Honor, since Miss Brennan became HOA president. Violation notices have increased by over 300%. She has targeted multiple homeowners for minor or questionable infractions. In Mr. Lockhart's case, she is attempting to charge him $4,500 per day in fines, plus storage fees for property she had no right to take. Judge Morrison turned to Patricia, who was sitting rigidly in her chair. Miss Brennan, you are the HOA president. Patricia stood. Yes, Your Honor. Did you personally authorize the seizure of Mr. Lockhart's snowmobiles? Yes, Your Honor. They were in clear violation and he refused to comply. And did you obtain a court order before taking this action? Patricia hesitated. The board believed we had the authority under our governing documents. Belief is not the same as actual authority, Miss Brennan. Miss Walsh, does your client understand that seizing property without proper legal authority is theft under Alaska law? Rebecca Walsh looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, I advised the board to pursue legal channels first, but they chose to act independently before consulting me. That statement clearly threw Patricia under the bus, and you could see the realization cross Patricia's face. She had acted without proper legal advice, and now her own attorney was distancing herself from the decision. Judge Morrison made some notes, then looked up with a stern expression. Here is my ruling. The HOA had no legal authority to seize Mr. Lockhart's property. The seizure was illegal. I am issuing an immediate injunction requiring the return of all 3 snowmobiles within 24 hours, in the same condition they were in when taken. All fines and fees imposed on Mr. Lockhart related to this matter are void. Additionally, I am ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Lockhart's legal fees to date. Patricia started to stand, but her attorney pulled her back down. Judge Morrison was not finished. Furthermore, I am deeply troubled by the HOA's actions here. I am ordering a full accounting of all violation notices and fines issued by the Pine Ridge Estates HOA in the past 2 years. I want to see if there is a pattern of abuse. That report is due back to this court in 30 days. If I find evidence of systematic harassment or illegal actions, there will be consequences. Do I make myself clear, Miss Brennan? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said quietly, her face pale. Miss Walsh, I suggest you have a serious conversation with your client about the limits of HOA authority. This hearing is adjourned. I felt relief wash over me. David shook my hand as we stood. That went better than I expected. She is really unhappy with them. We walked out of the courtroom and I could hear Patricia arguing with Rebecca Walsh behind us. I did not care. I was getting my snowmobiles back. The next day, I received a call from a storage facility on the outskirts of Eagle River. They informed me that my snowmobiles were ready for pickup. When I arrived, all 3 machines were sitting in a locked unit, seemingly undamaged. I spent an hour inspecting every inch of them, checking for scratches, mechanical issues, anything that might have happened during the seizure. Thankfully, they appeared fine. The storage facility manager had me sign some paperwork confirming receipt, and I arranged for a trailer to transport them home. Getting my property back should have been the end of it, but I was still furious about what Patricia and the HOA board had put me through. I had spent over $5,000 in legal fees, taken time off work, and endured enormous stress. David had mentioned that the judge ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees, but he warned me that actually collecting might require additional court action. About a week after the hearing, I received a formal letter from the HOA's law firm. It included a check for my legal fees and a brief apology stating that the board had acted without proper legal guidance. The letter was professional but cold, clearly written by their attorney with no personal sentiment from Patricia or the board. It was not satisfactory, but at least I got my money back. A month passed, and I heard nothing more about the judge's order for an accounting of HOA violations. I assumed it was proceeding behind the scenes. Then one evening in early March, my doorbell rang. It was my neighbor from 3 houses down, a woman named Ellen Norton. "Xavier, have you seen the notice?" she asked, holding up a piece of paper. "What notice?" The judge ordered the HOA to provide every homeowner with a detailed explanation of their violations and fines. I just got mine, and it is insane. They claimed I owed $800 for having my trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day. I had put them out the night before pickup because I had to leave early for work. $800. She handed me the paper. It was indeed a detailed accounting, and it was shocking. The document showed that under Patricia's leadership, the HOA had issued over 200 violations to the 85 homes in our community. The total fines imposed exceeded $400,000. Some people had been hit with multiple violations. One homeowner owed $12,000 according to the HOA's records, for infractions ranging from lawn height to unauthorized patio furniture. "This is crazy," I said, reading through the list. "Has anyone actually paid these fines?" Some people have, out of fear. But most of us have just been getting nastier and nastier letters. I think Patricia was building up this war chest of fines to force people into compliance or to foreclose on properties. She cannot foreclose for HOA fines, can she? Apparently she can if the fines are in the CC and Articus, and you do not pay. She has been threatening people. This was bigger than just my snowmobiles. Patricia had been running a systematic harassment campaign against the entire neighborhood, using fear and intimidation to control everyone. I felt my anger returning. The next day, I called David Morrison again. "Did you see the accounting the judge ordered?" "I did. She forwarded it to me as well. It is worse than I thought. Judge Morrison is not going to like this." "What happens now?" "There is another hearing scheduled for next week. The judge wants to review the findings with the HOA board present. I suggest you attend. In fact, I think a lot of homeowners should attend. This affects everyone." I spent the next few days spreading the word through the neighborhood. Social media made it easy. We had a Pine Ridge Estates community Facebook group that Patricia had tried to control, but several residents had created a separate group specifically to discuss HOA issues. I posted about the hearing, and within hours, over 50 homeowners said they would attend. The following Tuesday, the Anchorage courthouse was packed. The courtroom could not hold everyone, so they had to move us to a larger hearing room. David represented me, but several other homeowners had also hired attorneys. Patricia showed up with Rebecca Walsh, and you could tell she was nervous. Judge Morrison entered, looking at the crowd with surprise. "Well, this is quite a turnout. Let me start by saying that I have reviewed the accounting submitted by the Pine Ridge Estates HOA, and I have serious concerns." This appears to be a pattern of aggressive and potentially abusive enforcement that goes well beyond reasonable community management. She turned to Patricia. Miss Brennan, in the 2 years before you became HOA president, this community issued an average of 12 violations per year. In the 2 years of your presidency, you have issued over 200 violations and imposed over $400,000 in fines. Can you explain this dramatic increase? Patricia stood, her voice shaking slightly. Your Honor, I was simply enforcing the rules that were already in place. The previous board was lax, and the community standards had declined. I was elected to restore order and property values. By fining people into financial hardship, I see here that you attempted to fine Mr. Lockhart $4,500 per day. That would have been over $1.6 million in a year, for snowmobiles parked on his own property. Does that seem reasonable to you? The rules state that recreational vehicles cannot be visible from the street. The rules state that recreational vehicles on trailers cannot be visible. You have consistently misinterpreted or deliberately misrepresented the CC and Arctic S to suit your preferences. I also see that you issued yourself 0 violations during this period, despite multiple complaints from homeowners that you have garden decorations and exterior lighting that violate the same standards you are enforcing against others. A murmur ran through the crowd. I had not known that detail, but it did not surprise me. Patricia seemed like exactly the type to hold others to standards she did not follow herself. Judge Morrison continued, I also have reviewed the financial records of the HOA, which I subpoenaed as part of this investigation. Miss Brennan, you authorized over $60,000 in spending from HOA funds without board approval, including hiring a private security company to patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. Is that correct? Rebecca Walsh stood up quickly. Your Honor, I was not aware of that. The board only recently brought me in as counsel. I understand, Miss Walsh. I'm not holding you responsible for your client's actions prior to your engagement. However, Miss Brennan, unauthorized spending of HOA funds is a serious matter. That money belongs to the homeowners collectively, not to you personally to spend as you wish. Patricia looked like she was going to be sick. I was trying to improve the community. Everything I did was for the good of property values. Property values are not improved by making homeowners miserable and imposing unreasonable fines. In fact, I would argue you have damaged property values by creating a hostile living environment. Here is what is going to happen. All violations and fines issued during your tenure as HOA president are hereby voided, pending individual review. Any homeowner who paid fines under your enforcement regime will be refunded. The HOA will bear that cost. More murmuring from the crowd, this time positive. People were nodding and whispering excitedly. Additionally, Judge Morrison said, her voice growing sterner, I am removing you, Miss Brennan, from your position as HOA president, effective immediately. You are also barred from serving on the HOA board in any capacity for a period of 5 years. The remaining board members will elect an interim president, and the community will hold new elections within 60 days. Patricia started crying, actually crying, right there in the courtroom. You cannot do this. I was elected by the community. I absolutely can do this, Miss Brennan. You have abused your position, mismanaged community funds, and created a hostile environment for your fellow homeowners. Consider yourself fortunate that I am not referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges related to the unauthorized spending and illegal seizure of property. That last sentence made Patricia go silent. The threat of criminal charges was clearly not something she had considered. Now, regarding Mr. Lockhart specifically, Miss Brennan, you not only illegally seized his property, but you have caused him significant distress and financial burden. The court has ordered return of his legal fees, but I believe additional remedies are warranted. Mr. Morrison, what are you seeking for your client? David stood. Your Honor, my client requests a formal public apology from the HOA and Miss Brennan personally, published in the Anchorage Daily News and the local Eagle River Star newspaper. He also requests nominal damages for the distress and inconvenience caused. How much in nominal damages? $10,000, Your Honor. Judge Morrison thought for a moment. I am granting both requests. Miss Brennan, you and the HOA board will jointly compose a letter of apology to Mr. Lockhart, explaining what happened and acknowledging that the seizure was illegal and unjustified. This letter will be published in both newspapers Mr. Morrison mentioned, in a quarter-page advertisement, at the HOA's expense. Additionally, the HOA will pay Mr. Lockhart $10,000 in damages within 30 days. These are not requests. These are court orders. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Not only was I vindicated, but Patricia was being publicly held accountable for her actions. The apology in the newspapers would ensure everyone knew what she had done. Judge Morrison addressed the room full of homeowners. For everyone else present, I encourage you to get involved in your HOA. Attend meetings, vote in elections, and hold your board members accountable. An HOA is meant to be a benefit to a community, not a weapon used by power-hungry individuals. You all have the power to make your community what you want it to be. Use that power. She banged her gavel. This matter is concluded. The room erupted in applause. People were standing, cheering, some even hugging. It felt like we had won a major victory against a dictator. Patricia rushed out of the room, still crying, with Rebecca Walsh following her, looking resigned. Over the next few weeks, things in Pine Ridge Estates changed dramatically. Patricia resigned from the HOA board entirely, not just from the presidency. Her husband quietly put their house on the market a month later. George, the older board member who had suggested consulting an attorney during that first contentious meeting, was elected interim president. He immediately instituted new policies requiring board votes for any expenditures over $1,000, and any violation notices to be reviewed by the full board before being sent to homeowners. The apology letter appeared in both newspapers as ordered. It was carefully worded by Rebecca Walsh to be legally precise, while still acknowledging wrongdoing. The letter explained that the HOA had improperly seized my snowmobiles, that the violation notice was based on a misinterpretation of community rules, and that the HOA apologized for the distress and inconvenience caused to me and my family. It also noted that Judge Morrison had voided all violations issued during Patricia's tenure pending review. Seeing that apology in print, taking up a quarter page of the Anchorage Daily News, was incredibly satisfying. People I barely knew stopped me at the grocery store and gas station to talk about it. Most were supportive, sharing their own HOA horror stories. A few older residents grumbled that the judge had overstepped and that communities needed strong enforcement, but they were in the minority. The $10,000 in damages arrived via check from the HOA's law firm exactly 28 days after the hearing, 2 days before the deadline. I deposited it and used part of it to take my wife Emma on a vacation to Hawaii. She had been incredibly supportive through the entire ordeal, and she deserved something good after months of stress. Emma had been furious when the snowmobiles were seized. She grew up in Alaska, just like me, and she understood how important outdoor recreation was to our lifestyle. The idea that some busybody neighbor could just take our property had offended her on a deep level. When the check arrived, she actually suggested using some of it to throw a neighborhood party, inviting everyone who had been victimized by Patricia's reign of terror. We ended up doing exactly that in June, once the weather was nice. We rented the community clubhouse, the same place where those contentious HOA meetings had been held, and invited the entire neighborhood. Over 60 people showed up. We had a barbecue, played lawn games, and people shared their stories about dealing with Patricia. It was therapeutic in a way to laugh about it all now that it was over. One of my neighbors, Tom, told me he had received a violation for having rust spots on his mailbox. Patricia had demanded he replace the entire mailbox within a week or face a $500 fine. Tom was a retired veteran on a fixed income, and the mailbox was old but functional. He had been terrified he would lose his house over it. When Judge Morrison voided all the violations, Tom said he cried with relief. Stories like that reminded me that this fight had been about more than just my snowmobiles. Patricia had been wielding the HOA like a weapon against vulnerable people who could not afford to fight back. I was fortunate to have the resources to hire a good attorney and take her to court. Not everyone had that option. Around this time, the new HOA board conducted the comprehensive review of violations that Judge Morrison had ordered. They set up a committee of 5 homeowners who were not on the board, plus one board member to act as liaison. I was asked to serve on the committee, and I agreed. We spent several evenings going through every single violation Patricia had issued, evaluating whether it was legitimate under the actual CC and Articus, or whether she had overstepped. The results were damning. Of the 208 violations Patricia had issued, only 43 were clearly valid under the community rules. These were things like actual inoperable vehicles left on the street, significant property damage that affected neighboring homes, or clear safety hazards. The rest were either complete fabrications, gross misinterpretations of the rules, or Patricia applying her personal aesthetic preferences as if they were law. The committee recommended that all homeowners who had paid fines for invalid violations be refunded, which would cost the HOA over $70,000. The board voted unanimously to accept the recommendation. They also voted to pursue legal action against Patricia personally to recover some of the improperly spent HOA funds, particularly the money she had paid to the private security company. That legal action turned into a whole separate mess. Patricia and her husband hired their own attorney, different from Rebecca Walsh, and fought the HOA's claims. It dragged out for nearly a year with depositions, document production, and all the other tedious aspects of civil litigation. Eventually, they settled. Patricia agreed to reimburse the HOA $30,000, paid in installments over 3 years. Her house sold in the meantime, and she and her husband moved to Wasilla, a town about 45 minutes north. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she tried to get on the HOA board in her new community, and was rejected after someone looked up what had happened in Pine Ridge Estates. The refunds to homeowners happened much faster. The HOA sent out checks within 3 months of the committee's report. Some people got back a few $100s, others several thousand. One couple, who had been hit with repeated violations for things like outdoor Christmas decorations and the wrong color welcome mat, received over $6,000. They used it to take their kids to Disneyland, posting pictures on the neighborhood Facebook group with a caption thanking Judge Morrison. Life slowly returned to normal. My snowmobiles sat peacefully on their concrete pad, and nobody bothered me about them anymore. The new HOA board issued only 4 violations in their first year, all for legitimate issues like abandoned vehicles or serious property maintenance problems. It felt like the community was healing from the trauma Patricia had inflicted. I continued to enjoy my snowmobiling hobby, probably even more than before, because I no longer took it for granted. Every time I fired up one of those machines and headed out to the trails, I felt grateful for the judge who had seen through Patricia's abuse of power, and for the legal system that, despite its flaws, had ultimately worked in my favor. One interesting development was that Judge Morrison's handling of our case apparently caught attention beyond Eagle River. About 8 months after the final hearing, I was contacted by a reporter from the Anchorage Daily News who was writing a feature article about HOA abuses in Alaska. The reporter, Jennifer Martinez, had seen the published apology and wanted to interview me about my experience. I agreed to speak with her, figuring that publicizing these issues might help other people dealing with similar situations. We met at a coffee shop in Anchorage, and I spent 2 hours telling her the whole story. She took detailed notes, and she told me she was interviewing other homeowners across the state who had dealt with aggressive HOA enforcement. The problem is that HOA boards are given a lot of power, but there is very little oversight, Jennifer explained. Most people do not even realize they can challenge HOA actions in court. They just assume the board has absolute authority. That is what Patricia was counting on, I said. She figured she could intimidate people into compliance, and for a lot of my neighbors it worked. They were terrified. What do you think needs to change? There should be clearer limits on what HOAs can do without court oversight. Taking someone's property, like they did with my snowmobiles, should absolutely require a court order. And there should be an easier way to challenge violations without having to hire an expensive attorney. Maybe some kind of state ombudsman for HOA disputes. Jennifer included those comments in her article, which was published the following month. It was a full-page feature with the headline, "When HOAs Go Too Far, Alaska Homeowners Fight Back Against Aggressive Enforcement." My case was the lead example, and the article included excerpts from Judge Morrison's rulings. It also profiled 3 other Alaskan homeowners who had successfully challenged their HOAs in court, as well as 2 who had lost, because they could not afford adequate legal representation. The article generated significant response. The Alaska state legislature was already considering a bill to reform HOA regulations, and the article gave the effort additional momentum. Representatives from both parties cited it during floor debates. The bill ultimately passed the following year, creating new requirements for HOA transparency, limiting certain enforcement powers, and establishing a state-level mediation process for HOA disputes. I was even invited to testify before the State House Judiciary Committee when they were considering the bill. I took a day off work and drove to Juneau with Emma. Standing before the committee in the state capitol building, telling my story to elected officials who were actually listening and taking notes, felt surreal. I was just a regular guy who had wanted to keep his snowmobiles on his own property, and somehow that simple desire had turned into this much larger movement. During my testimony, I focused on the human impact of Patricia's actions. This was not just about vehicles or fines, I told the committee. It was about feeling unsafe in my own home. It was about a neighbor who weaponized the HOA rules to control and punish people she did not like, and it could have bankrupted me if I had not had the resources to fight back. A lot of people in my neighborhood were not so fortunate. They paid fines they could not afford because they were too scared to resist. One of the legislators, Representative Sarah Klein from Fairbanks, asked me, if you could give advice to other homeowners dealing with aggressive HOA enforcement, what would you say? Document everything. Keep copies of all notices, all communications, everything. Know your actual CC and Articus inside and out. Do not just take the HOA's word for what the rules say. And if you think they are overstepping, consult with an attorney before you pay any fines. Once you pay, it is much harder to get that money back. Finally, get involved in your HOA. Go to meetings, vote in elections, and hold the board accountable. These boards only have the power we give them. The committee seemed impressed with that answer. The bill passed out of committee with bipartisan support and eventually became law. Governor Mike Dunleavy signed it in a small ceremony, and several of the homeowners who had testified, including me, were invited to attend. It felt good knowing that our experiences would help protect other Alaskans from similar abuses. Back in Pine Ridge Estates, the community continued to thrive under responsible HOA leadership. George served out his term as president and then stepped down, and a younger couple, Marcus and Ellen Norton, ran for the board together with a platform of minimal enforcement and maximum community engagement. They won easily. The Nortons organized regular community events, including a summer barbecue series, a winter lights competition, and volunteer days to maintain the common areas. The HOA stopped being something people feared and became something that actually added value to living in the neighborhood. Property values went up, not because of aggressive enforcement of petty rules, but because people genuinely wanted to live there. My snowmobiles remained exactly where they had always been, sitting on that concrete pad beside my garage. Every time I looked at them, I remembered the fight I had had to go through to keep them there. It made me appreciate my property rights and the legal system that had protected them. About 2 years after the whole ordeal ended, I ran into Rebecca Walsh, the attorney who had represented the HOA during the court hearings, at a legal conference in Anchorage. I was there because David Morrison had invited me to speak on a panel about HOA litigation from a homeowner's perspective. Rebecca approached me during a break, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Mr. Lockhart, I am glad I ran into you. I wanted to apologize for my client's actions. I should have reined in Patricia much earlier." By the time I got fully involved, she had already committed to such an aggressive course that it was hard to walk things back. I appreciated the apology. You were in a tough position. Patricia was not exactly someone who took advice well. That is putting it mildly. I have been practicing HOA law for 15 years, and I have never seen a board president so determined to punish homeowners. It was like she had a personal vendetta against everyone. After Judge Morrison ruled against us, the rest of the board finally realized how bad things had gotten, and they asked me to help them clean up the mess. Working with the new leadership was night and day different. George and the new board seemed to be doing things right, I agreed. They are. And honestly, what happened in Pine Ridge Estates changed how I advise all my HOA clients now. I am much more aggressive about telling boards when they are overstepping. I do not want to be in a courtroom again watching a judge dismantle my client's actions piece by piece. We talked for a few more minutes before the conference resumed. It was interesting to see how the case had affected not just the homeowners, but also the professionals who worked in this area of law. Patricia's overreach had created ripples that extended far beyond our little neighborhood. As time passed, the story of my fight with the HOA became something of a legend in Eagle River. New residents moving into Pine Ridge Estates would hear about it from their neighbors. Some people even mentioned it when they were considering buying homes in the community, seeing it as proof that the HOA was now accountable and reasonable. I stayed involved with the HOA, attending meetings regularly and serving on various committees. I wanted to make sure that what had happened under Patricia's leadership never happened again. The vigilance paid off. The community maintained high standards without being oppressive, and homeowners felt like they had a voice. My snowmobiles, those 3 machines that had caused so much trouble, continued to serve me well. I rode them regularly during the winter months, exploring the backcountry trails around Eagle River, sometimes alone and sometimes with friends from the neighborhood who shared my passion for outdoor recreation. The machines were more than just vehicles to me now. They represented something important: the right to enjoy my own property without unreasonable interference. Emma and I even started hosting an annual snowmobile trip for interested neighbors. We would plan a route through some of the most scenic trails in the Chugach Mountains, pack lunches, and spend a full day out in the wilderness. It became a popular event, with a dozen or more people joining us each year. Some folks bought their own snowmobiles after coming on these trips, and they too kept them parked on their properties without any harassment from the HOA. One of the most satisfying moments came about 3 years after the court case ended. I was elected to the HOA board myself, winning by a wide margin. I had not really wanted to serve, but several neighbors convinced me that my experience and commitment to reasonable governance would be valuable. I agreed to a 2-year term. Serving on the board gave me a new perspective on HOA management. It was not easy to balance the needs and preferences of 85 different households, all with their own opinions about what the community should look like. But by focusing on actual safety and maintenance issues, rather than aesthetic nitpicking, we were able to keep the neighborhood well maintained without making anyone miserable. During my time on the board, we only issued 12 violation notices, and 11 of those were resolved with friendly conversations rather than fines. The 12th involved a homeowner who had abandoned a project halfway through, leaving a torn-up front yard for over 6 months. Even then, we worked with the person to create a reasonable timeline for completion rather than just hitting them with fines. The approach worked. Pine Ridge Estates maintained property values among the highest in Eagle River, but without the toxic enforcement culture that Patricia had created. Real estate agents started using our community as an example of an HOA done right, and homes sold quickly when they came on the market. I also stayed in touch with David Morrison, who had become more than just my attorney. He became a friend. We would occasionally meet for coffee or a beer, and he would tell me about other HOA cases he was handling. My case had apparently raised his profile in that particular area of law, and he was now one of the go-to attorneys in Alaska for homeowners fighting their HOAs. "You were the perfect client," David told me once. "You had documented everything. You knew your CC and Arctic cold, and you were clearly in the right. Cases like yours make my job easy. Most of the ones I get now are much more complicated, but your case helped establish some important precedents that I can cite." It was interesting to think that my fight over snowmobiles had legal implications beyond just my own situation. David explained that Judge Morrison's ruling, particularly the part about HOAs needing clear authority before seizing property, had been cited in several subsequent cases across Alaska. The published apology requirement had also become a tool that other attorneys used to negotiate settlements, pointing to my case as precedent. Looking back on everything that happened, from that first violation notice under my windshield wiper to testifying before the state legislature, I still feel a mix of emotions. Anger at what Patricia put me and my neighbors through, frustration at the stress and expense of fighting back, but also satisfaction that we won, that justice prevailed, and that the experience led to meaningful changes. I never set out to become some kind of HOA reform activist. I just wanted to keep my snowmobiles on my property and enjoy my hobby. But sometimes life pushes you into situations where you have to stand up for yourself and others, even when it is difficult and expensive and uncertain. The physical scars of that battle were minimal. My snowmobiles came back undamaged, my property was fine, and I eventually recovered my legal costs and then some. But the emotional and psychological impact lasted much longer. For months after the seizure, I felt anxious every time I left my house, worried that I would come home to find something else had been taken or vandalized. It took a long time to feel secure again. Emma noticed the change in me. She said I started checking the driveway more frequently, looking to make sure the snowmobiles were still there. I would drive by the house during my lunch break sometimes, just to verify everything was okay. It was a form of trauma, I suppose, having your property stolen by people who were supposed to be working for your benefit. Therapy helped. I talked to a counselor for a few months, working through the feelings of violation and powerlessness that came from the seizure. The counselor helped me understand that my reaction was normal, that having someone take your property from your own land is a significant violation of security and trust. Gradually, the anxiety faded, though I never completely forgot how it felt to see that empty concrete pad where my machines had been. Patricia's fate remained something of a mystery. After she moved to Wasilla, I heard occasional updates through mutual acquaintances, but nothing detailed. Someone told me she had gotten divorced, though I do not know if that was related to the HOA debacle or something else entirely. Another rumor suggested she had tried to start a blog about property values and homeowner responsibilities, but it never gained traction. Mostly, she faded from my awareness, becoming just an unpleasant memory rather than an active presence in my life. The concrete pad where my snowmobile sat became something of a symbol in the neighborhood. When new residents moved in and asked about the distinctive setup, neighbors would tell them the story of the HOA battle. Some people thought it was funny, others were horrified, but everyone agreed it was a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I sometimes wondered if I had overreacted by taking the case to court rather than just moving the snowmobiles somewhere out of sight. Emma and I discussed it a few times over the years. Each time, we concluded that fighting back had been the right decision, not just for us but for everyone in the community. If I had caved to Patricia's demands, it would have emboldened her to become even more aggressive with others. By standing up to her, I helped stop a tyrant. The years passed and life moved on. My snowmobiles aged, requiring more maintenance but still running strong. I eventually bought a fourth machine, a newer model with better technology, but I kept the original 3 as well. They had sentimental value now, beyond their functional purpose. Emma and I talked occasionally about moving to a different house, maybe something with more land or in a different part of Alaska. But we always came back to the fact that we loved our home and our community. Pine Ridge Estates, despite the Patricia years, was a good place to live. The neighbors were friendly. The location was perfect for outdoor activities, and we had invested so much effort into making the HOA functional that it seemed wrong to leave. Our investment paid off in ways we had not expected. The community spirit that developed after Patricia's ouster was genuine and lasting. People looked out for each other, not in a nosy, busybody way, but with genuine care. When one family had a house fire and needed temporary housing, 3 different neighbors offered their spare rooms. When another resident's spouse died suddenly, the community organized meal trains and yard care without being asked. This was what an HOA could be at its best, not an enforcement mechanism for petty rules, but a framework for neighbors to support each other and maintain shared spaces. The common areas in Pine Ridge Estates were beautiful, with walking trails, a small playground, and landscaping that changed with the seasons. The HOA budget went toward maintaining these amenities and hosting community events, not toward hiring security companies to spy on residents. I retired from the HOA board after my 2-year term, feeling like I had contributed what I could. New leadership came in, people with fresh ideas and energy, and they continued the positive direction. The community was in good hands. My own life continued its normal rhythms. Work, family, outdoor recreation, and community involvement filled my days. The legal battle over my snowmobiles became just one chapter in a longer story, important but not defining. I was more than the guy who fought his HOA. I was a husband, a worker, a neighbor, an outdoorsman, and a citizen. But I never forgot the lessons I learned from that experience. Power unchecked leads to abuse. Bullies only back down when confronted. The legal system, for all its flaws, can still provide justice. And communities work best when people are involved and hold their leaders accountable. Years later, long after the drama had faded into neighborhood history, I would sometimes stand in my driveway and look at those snowmobiles on their concrete pad. They were just machines, metal and plastic and rubber, but they represented something more. They represented the principle that your home is your castle, that you have rights that must be respected, and that standing up to injustice, even when it is hard, is always worthwhile. The judge had ordered the apology published in the newspaper, and that public acknowledgement of wrongdoing had been important. But the real victory was not in the court ruling or the published apology or even the $10,000 in damages. The real victory was in reclaiming my sense of security and control over my own property. It was in knowing that I had not let a bully win. It was in the reforms that protected other homeowners from similar abuse. Sometimes people ask me if I would do it all again, knowing the stress and cost involved. The answer is always yes. Some fights are worth having, not because they are easy or pleasant, but because they are necessary. My fight with Patricia and the HOA was one of those fights. And in the end, despite the difficulty, justice prevailed.